Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're wandering softly through the Middle Ages, a world lit by candlelight and governed by seasons. We'll pass through kitchens heavy with smoke, fields furrowed by hand, and churches where the air smelled faintly of wax and rain. These are 100 relaxing facts about medieval life. Before we start, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable, let's begin. Most medieval mornings began not with light, but with rhythm. The day announced itself through sound. The tolling of the church bell, the shuffling of livestock, the scrape of wooden doors pulled open to meet the chill. Few people owned clocks, and even fewer needed them. Time was measured by the ear, the crow of the rooster, the bell for morning prayers, the hum of the village returning to life. The bell was more than a signal. It was a form of governance. It marks the hours for labour and for worship, keeping every soul, from the poorest peasant to the local lord, bound to the same audible schedule. The world at dawn was quiet but purposeful. Monks moved toward their chapels, farmers toward the fields, and craftsmen toward the tools left waiting overnight. Light crept slowly into stone and thatch, but the day had already begun. Medieval life depended on this early discipline. Without mechanical clocks, it was the senses, especially hearing, that told people when to rise, when to work, and when to rest. In that dim blue hour, long before modern timekeeping or artificial light, the day's order emerged from sound itself, a steady, familiar pulse that carried through centuries. Once the day had been sounded awake, it began in earnest with a simple meal. Breakfast in the Middle Ages was rarely indulgent and often optional. For most working people, it served one purpose: to sustain the body long enough to reach midday. A piece of coarse bread, perhaps a heel left from the previous day, was softened in weak ale or milk and eaten quickly, sometimes while standing. The ale, mildly fermented and low in alcohol, was the safest drink available. Water could carry disease, but boiled and brewed ale offered a small margin of protection. That habit soon made essential. Only children, labourers, and the ill were expected to eat in the early hours. Others might wait until dinner at noon, which was considered the day's main meal. In monasteries, morning fare was determined by strict rules of fasting and abstinence, while the wealthy might add cheese, meat, or dried fruit. Yet even among the fortunate, breakfast lacked ceremony. It was practical, repetitive, and rarely discussed. In a society defined by work, food was a tool, another part of the machinery that kept the fields ploughed, the hearths burning, and the long hours of daylight filled with labour. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, so constant and essential that it was often used as a synonym for food itself. After the simple breakfast that sustained the morning's work, bread reappeared at every meal, changing only in texture and quality according to one's place in society. The wealthy ate fine white loaves made from carefully sifted wheat flour, soft and pale enough to signal privilege. The poor, meanwhile, relied on darker, denser bread, baked from rye, barley or oats, grains cheaper, hardier, and more filling, but far less refined. Even within the same village, bread revealed the divide between abundance and subsistence. Flour was seldom pure. Millstones left traces of grit that wore down teeth over time, and in years of bad harvest, bread might be stretched with peas, beans, or even ground acorns. It was baked in communal ovens, the heartbeat of village life, where households shared heat and gossip while waiting for their loaves to rise. For the poorest, bread could serve as both plate and portion, a trencher to soak up broth, and then be eaten at the end of the meal. However humble or grand the table, life quite literally depended on the harvest that made it possible. Alongside bread, ale was the other constant on the medieval table, not a luxury, but a necessity. Clean water was unreliable, drawn from rivers and wells easily contaminated by livestock or waste. Brewing made it safer, since the process of boiling and fermenting killed most bacteria long before anyone understood what they were. The result was a mild, cloudy drink that nourished as much as it refreshed, providing calories and trace nutrients, in addition to hydration. Even children drank it, since it contained far less alcohol than modern beer, often no stronger than today's soft drinks in effect. Ale was brewed locally, often by women known as alewives, who tended small batches in their homes. It soured quickly, so it had to be made fresh and consumed within a few days. Larger towns supported communal brewhouses, while monasteries perfected the art into something closer to craft. Every social class relied on it, from peasants in the field to monks at prayer, though the wealthy might also drink wine imported at great expense. In a world without reliable sanitation or refrigeration, ale provided both comfort and safety. It was as much a part of daily life as the bread it accompanied, simple, sustaining, and quietly essential. The homes in which this daily bread and ale were consumed were often simple, dark and filled with smoke. In poorer cottages, the fire that cooked the meals also served as the only source of heat and light. Chimneys were uncommon until the later Middle Ages, and even then, they remained expensive to build and maintain. Most houses relied instead on a central hearth with an opening in the roof or a gap under the eaves to let the smoke escape, though much of it lingered stubbornly in the rafters. The air indoors was thick, carrying the scent of wood, peat, and damp straw, and the walls grew blackened over time. In most medieval homes, the hearth served as both the physical and emotional centre of daily life. It was where the day's labour ended and where the household gathered to rest, eat, and repair what could be repaired. The fire was rarely allowed to die completely. Embers were banked under ash overnight and coaxed back to life each morning. Around its glow, families prepared meals, mended tools, and shared what little light remained after sunset. The warmth softened not only the cold of the air, but the harshness of existence itself, turning a crude space into something resembling comfort. The hearth also held symbolic weight. It represented stability and continuity, a flame that tied generations together in a world of uncertainty. In wealthier houses, the fireplace became a mark of refinement, built of stone with carved mantles and proper chimneys, but the principle was the same. The fire's glow defined the boundaries of home. Outside its reach, the world was cold, unpredictable, and often dangerous. Within it, even the poorest could find a few hours of safety before the next dawn. The flicker of the hearth was as close as most medieval people came to luxury. Warmth earned, light shared, and a moment of rest before work began again. Keeping the hearth alive required constant effort, and fuel was among the most valuable resources a household could secure. In early medieval centuries, wood was plentiful, gathered from nearby forests or common lands, but by the later Middle Ages it had become scarce and costly in many regions. Expanding towns, shipbuilding and metalworking consumed vast quantities of timber, leaving peasants to rely on whatever they could find. Firewood was sold by the bundle, and for poorer families it was often too expensive to use freely. The hearth had to be managed carefully, its flames kept small and steady rather than bright. When wood ran short, alternatives filled the gap. In lowland areas, people dug blocks of peat from the marshes, which burned slowly with a heavy, earthy scent. In others, dried dung or straw was used, producing more smoke than heat, but enough to warm a pot or dry damp clothes. Ashes were sifted and reused for washing or as fertiliser, nothing wasted. The smell of these improvised fuels hung in the air of villages, mingling with that of livestock and cooking. Warmth was never taken for granted. A good fire meant comfort, survival, and one less reason to fear the long winter night ahead. Cooking in the medieval home was a slow, practical art, shaped by necessity rather than choice. With the fire at the centre of domestic life, most meals were prepared in a single pot, suspended over the flames by an iron hook or chain. Adjustable brackets allowed the cook to raise or lower the pot, controlling the heat in a time before stoves or precise measurements. Into it went whatever the household could spare: grains, root vegetables, scraps of meat, or bones left from a previous feast. The result was a thick stew known as pottage, endlessly adaptable and perpetually simmering. It could be thinned with ale, thickened with bread, or stretched to feed one more hungry mouth. This method made sense in a world where food was scarce and fuel precious. A single pot required little supervision and could be left to bubble gently while other work was done. The scent of onions, leeks and herbs mixed with smoke to define the atmosphere of a medieval home, far more than any perfume or incense. Over time, flavours deepened, and what began as survival became comfort. In its quiet way, the pottage pot was both a symbol of endurance and a reminder that contentment often began with warmth and patience. The aroma of cooking was one of the few luxuries that reached beyond the walls of a peasant home. Wattle and daub construction, woven wooden slats plastered with a mixture of mud, straw and dung, was common throughout medieval villages. These houses were built quickly, using materials close at hand, and they breathed with the weather. Gaps in the walls allowed warmth and scent to escape, while wind and rain occasionally crept in. From the outside, a row of such cottages carried a faint, comforting haze of smoke and stew, a sign that life continued in spite of hardship. The smell of onions, barley and herbs was familiar everywhere, binding rich and poor through the same simple hunger. Inside, the air was thick and fragrant, layered with the mingled odours of food, animals and damp earth. Most houses had no clear division between kitchen and stable, so the warmth of the hearth often reached both humans and livestock. These shared spaces reflected the practical nature of medieval life: survival over comfort, function over form. Yet through those thin, imperfect walls came the sounds and smells of a world persistently alive, a world that found small sweetness in its daily labours and refused to grow silent. Beneath the smoky air and rough walls, the floors of most medieval homes were made of little more than compacted earth. Known simply as the ground, they served as both foundation and floor, hard and uneven from years of use. To keep them cleaner and more comfortable, people covered the surface with rushes, bundles of reeds or straw cut from riverbanks and meadows. These were spread loosely, sometimes layered with herbs like lavender, mint or sweet flag to mask the odours of cooking, animals and damp. Over time, the rushes absorbed spills, soot and waste, gradually forming a dense mat that was replaced only a few times a year. In wealthier households, servants changed them more often, while in humbler cottages, new rushes might not appear until a major festival or the turn of the season. This practice gave medieval homes their distinctive mixture of fragrance and decay. It was an early attempt at cleanliness in a world where hygiene was understood differently, less about removing dirt than about managing it. The soft crunch of rushes underfoot became a familiar sound, part of the rhythm of daily life. Though primitive by modern standards, these simple floors offered warmth, insulation, and a small defence against the chill rising from the earth. As comfort increased, so did attention to detail, and even the simplest materials could become marks of refinement. In the houses of merchants, minor nobility, or prosperous clergy, the floor coverings that served as practical necessities in peasant cottages were transformed into small gestures of luxury. Fresh rushes were changed more frequently, and aromatic herbs such as mint, lavender, rosemary, or meadowsweet were scattered among them. These plants released fragrance when stepped on or warmed by the fire, masking the less pleasant smells of smoke, sweat and livestock that still lingered indoors. Scent carried symbolic value as well as comfort. Sweetness of air was linked with moral purity and good order, while foul odours were often seen as signs of corruption or sin. Servants replaced the rushes before festivals or the arrival of guests, ensuring that a household's cleanliness was visible, or at least perceptible to the senses. The wealthy might even display dried petals or spices from distant markets, proof of both means and taste. Though the walls might still be draughty and the rooms dim, the presence of these fragrances hinted at civility. In a world without soap or sanitation in the modern sense, scent itself became a form of status, announcing prosperity one breath at a time. Light in the medieval world was precious, and the way a home was lit revealed almost as much about status as the food on its table. Candles were the primary source of artificial light, though few could afford to use them freely. For most people, they were made of tallow, rendered animal fat that produced a dim, smoky flame, and a smell that clung to everything it touched. Tallow candles dripped unevenly, burned quickly, and had to be tended constantly to keep from guttering out. Still, they were vital on long winter nights, when the sun vanished early and the hearth fire could no longer illuminate the room. For the wealthy, light was cleaner and sweeter. Beeswax candles burned brighter, smelled faintly of honey, and symbolized spiritual as well as material purity. They were used in churches, monasteries, and the homes of nobles, a sign that one's soul and purse could afford refinement. The flicker of beeswax light was steady enough for reading, writing, or embroidery, luxuries that required hours after dark. Yet whether made of wax or tallow, the candle's glow remained fragile, its life measured in inches. In a world governed by shadow, every small flame reminded people of the fine line between comfort and darkness. Because candles and fuel were both costly, most households used them sparingly. Light was rationed with care, treated as a resource to be budgeted rather than enjoyed. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the working day effectively ended and darkness reclaimed the village. The hearth provided a faint glow, enough to finish a meal or find one's way across the room, but few dared to burn candles without purpose. A single flame might be reserved for necessary tasks, mending a tool, reading a prayer, or tending to the sick, before being pinched out to save what remained for the next night. The rhythm of life followed the natural light, drawing people into rest when the world itself dimmed. Evening was not entirely idle, but it was subdued. Families gathered near the dying fire, speaking softly or listening to the sounds of animals settling in their stalls. The absence of light encouraged reflection, silence, and sleep. Only the wealthy could afford to turn night into day with clusters of beeswax candles or oil lamps, allowing their feasts and conversations to stretch long into the hours of darkness. For everyone else, the night simply arrived and life paused, not out of choice, but out of necessity. As evening deepened and the last traces of light faded, the sound of the curfew bell drifted across medieval towns and villages. The word curfew came from the old French couvre-feu, literally, cover the fire. Its toll was not a command to sleep, but a warning to bank the hearth, to smother open flames beneath ash, so that they would not spark into disaster during the night. Fire was both comfort and threat in a world built largely of wood and thatch, and a single stray ember could erase an entire street before dawn. The bell reminded everyone, from manor to cottage, to respect that fragile balance between warmth and ruin. Once the fires were secured, darkness fell completely. The streets emptied save for a few watchmen or travellers hurrying home. In towns, the ringing bell marked a shift from labour to quiet. The end of the market, the closing of the alehouse, the return to silence. In rural villages, it was simply part of the evening's rhythm, as familiar as the sound of the church clock at dawn. The curfew bell spoke of order and caution, a collective breath before the long night, ensuring that what little people had would still be standing when morning came. Furniture in most medieval homes reflected the same practicality that governed every other aspect of daily life. After banking the hearth and securing the night's safety, families settled around simple furnishings built to endure rather than impress. Benches and stools were the most common, often rough-hewn from oak or ash, and passed down for generations. Heavy chests served as both storage and seating, holding clothing, tools, or whatever few possessions a household owned. These multi-purpose pieces were essential in small single-room dwellings, where space had to be managed carefully. Tables were rare among the poor, and when present, little more than planks set across trestles that could be taken down when not in use. In wealthier homes, the same designs appeared in finer form, carved and polished, sometimes painted in bright colours that stood out against dim stone walls. Cushions and woven textiles softened the surfaces, signalling comfort as a mark of privilege. Yet even in manor halls, furniture remained heavy and functional, built to last rather than to change. The medieval idea of a furnished home was not about decoration, but endurance. Each piece carried the weight of labour, serving as a reminder that comfort, like warmth and light, was earned and carefully preserved. Glass was expensive and rarely found outside of churches, monasteries, or the houses of the very wealthy. For everyone else, windows were small openings, designed more for ventilation than for a view. To soften the wind and let in light, many were covered with oiled cloth, parchment, or thin slices of horn, scraped almost transparent. These materials filtered the daylight into a soft golden haze, blurring the outlines of the world outside. The result was a dim, honey-coloured glow that changed with the weather, brighter at noon, gentle and uncertain by dusk. Such windows could not be opened easily, and they offered little protection from cold or insects. In winter, they were sometimes shuttered with wood to keep out draughts, plunging the room into near darkness, except for the hearth. Yet that faint, filtered light gave medieval interiors their distinctive warmth, catching on smoke and dust in quiet suspension. It softened rough walls, lent shape to humble objects, and reminded those inside that day was still moving on beyond the narrow frame. In a world without clear panes or glass reflections, light entered like memory, softened, partial, and precious. In the rare homes or churches where it appeared, glass transformed light into a sign of privilege and wonder. True window glass was a luxury throughout much of the Middle Ages, costly to make and difficult to transport without damage. It was produced by skilled artisans who blew molten glass into large spheres or cylinders before cutting and flattening the cooled surface. The result was never perfectly smooth. Each pane carried subtle waves and bubbles, bending the outside world into gentle distortions that shimmered like reflections on water. To those accustomed to dim cottages or shuttered halls, such light felt almost miraculous. The uneven glass diffused sunlight rather than admitting it directly, filling interiors with a cool, translucent glow. In churches, coloured glass went further, turning daylight into a language of faith and beauty. Saints, angels, and stories from Scripture glimmered across the walls, instructing as much through light as through image. In noble houses, smaller panes were sometimes set into wooden latticework, less for clarity than for display. Even imperfect glass was admired, its flaws considered part of its charm. It represented mastery over both fire and fragility, proof that human hands could capture something as elusive and fleeting as light itself. In a world where every resource was hard-won, self-sufficiency defined the rhythm of medieval life. Each household, no matter how poor, was a small workshop of survival. Families produced what they could and bartered for what they could not, ensuring that little was ever truly wasted. Bread was baked at home or in the village oven. Cloth was spun and woven from wool shorn in spring, and tools were mended again and again until they broke beyond repair. Even stories were a kind of labour, shared in the evenings as both entertainment and inheritance, passed from mouth to mouth, like well-worn tools. This economy of necessity fostered skills that blurred the boundaries between work and life. A peasant knew how to plough, sow, thatch and carve. A housewife brewed ale, dyed wool, and kept the accounts in memory, if not on parchment. Every scrap of material had potential. Bones became handles, ashes became soap, and worn-out garments were unpicked for thread. Waste was not a moral failing, but an impossibility. The survival of each family depended on the quiet art of reuse, where even the smallest effort held value. In this way, medieval households were bound together by shared labour, thrift, and the unending cycle of making do. From an early age, children became part of the same unbroken cycle of work that sustained the household. Play existed, but duty arrived quickly. By the time a child could walk steadily, they were expected to contribute in some small way, scaring birds from the crops, gathering kindling, or tending animals. Learning was practical and immediate, passed from parent to child through demonstration rather than instruction. The village itself functioned as a school of labour, its lessons written in routine. Every task held a place in the long chain of survival, and every child learned where they fit within it. For most, childhood as we imagine it today did not exist. By 7 or 8, boys were often sent to work in the fields, or to learn a trade from a craftsman, while girls helped with spinning, cooking, or household management. Wealthier families might send their children to other homes for educational service, beginning their training in manners, literacy, or clerical life. Obedience was the first virtue taught, and endurance the second. Though affection was not absent, necessity left little room for indulgence. Growing up meant learning to labour, to listen, and to accept the role that birth and circumstance had quietly assigned. For children who left home early, apprenticeship was both an opportunity and a sentence. It offered the promise of a future trade, and with it, the faint hope of independence. But the path toward mastery was long and often harsh. Boys, and sometimes girls, were bound to a master craftsman by formal agreement, often arranged by their parents when the child was 10 or 12. In return for years of labour and obedience, they received training, lodging, and meagre sustenance. Wages were rare, replaced instead by the distant prospect of skill. The first lessons were not of artistry, but endurance, sweeping floors, fetching water, tending fires, and watching in silence until they were trusted with real tools. The apprenticeship system maintained the structure of medieval towns, ensuring that every generation produced carpenters, masons, smiths, and weavers to replace the last. For the poor, it was one of the few paths out of field labour, though few ever rose far beyond their masters. Some apprentices spent 7 years or more before earning the title of journeyman, allowed to work for wages but still far from the independence of a guild master. The system preserved knowledge and discipline alike, teaching not just craft, but the quiet acceptance that skill alone seldom freed anyone from the weight of poverty. Among the many trades that defined medieval life, none carried quite the same mixture of respect and necessity as the blacksmith's craft. The forge was both workplace and heartbeat of the village, its fire rarely cold even in the depths of winter. A blacksmith's day began before dawn, when the coals were coaxed back to life and the first ring of hammer on iron echoed through the mist. That sound carried far, steady, deliberate, and reassuring, a signal that work had begun and the tools of survival would soon be ready again. Every hinge, nail, and horseshoe passed through the blacksmith's hands, making his labour essential to both farm and household. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Sparks flew constantly, burns were inevitable, and the air grew thick with smoke and heat. Yet it was a craft of transformation. Raw ore turned to form and function through strength and precision. Apprentices stood beside their masters, learning by repetition, their movements becoming as rhythmic as breath. The forge symbolized endurance and creation, a place where human effort, quite literally, shaped the world. In a time when most possessions were fragile or handmade, the blacksmith's work was permanence itself, iron bound to purpose, hammered into the shape of daily life. The reach of the blacksmith's craft extended far beyond the walls of the forge. Ironwork was the silent infrastructure of medieval life, present in nearly every tool, weapon, and household object. The smallest items, nails, hinges, locks, and buckles, made construction and storage possible, while larger creations such as ploughshares and sickles determined the success of each harvest. Without iron, the rhythm of daily work would have faltered. It bound the world together, one piece at a time. Even the simple horseshoe, often taken for granted, was a quiet revolution. It allowed animals to work longer, travel farther, and endure harsher ground, multiplying the strength of both man and beast. The value of iron was so fundamental that it rarely drew attention. It was simply there, underfoot in hand, holding the door, or biting into the soil. Yet behind every piece lay skill and labour, the measured blows of the hammer, the hiss of water meeting heat, the patience of repetition. The blacksmith's art blurred the line between craft and necessity, faith and function. Each forged object was a promise of stability in an unpredictable world. Iron made permanence tangible, anchoring wooden villages to the earth and giving the fleeting efforts of human hands a trace of endurance. If iron shaped the tools of work, horses powered the movement of the medieval world. They were symbols of wealth, strength, and divine favour, but they were also living machines on which trade, travel, and warfare depended. A good horse could mean the difference between survival and ruin, and its care reflected that importance. Each day began and ended with the same quiet rituals: brushing the coat free of mud, checking hooves for stones, and feeding measured portions of grain or hay. These tasks were not only practical, but reverent, performed with a sense of gratitude for an animal that bore both burden and risk without complaint. Ownership of a horse marked one's social standing. Peasants might share a single workhorse among several families, while knights and nobles bred entire stables for battle and prestige. Monks blessed them, farriers tended their hooves, and travellers entrusted their lives to their endurance. Horses connected distant villages, carried goods to market, and carried men to war. Their presence filled medieval towns with sound: the clatter of hooves on stone, the creak of saddles, the steady breath of labour. To lose a horse was to lose mobility, livelihood, and pride. In many ways, these animals embodied the economy itself, patient, powerful, and indispensable. While horses were symbols of movement and status, cows and sheep were the quiet foundation of daily survival. Their value was intimate and continuous, measured not in prestige, but in sustenance. A family's cow provided milk that could be turned into butter or cheese, and when milk was scarce, it was mixed with oats to make a simple, filling meal. Sheep gave not only meat, but wool, the essential material for clothing, bedding and trade. These animals were woven into the rhythm of existence so deeply that they often received names and blessings, their temperaments as familiar as those of family members. In villages where few could read or write, people still knew each cow's markings, each sheep's habits, and each animal's place in the flock. Their care required constant attention, milking before dawn, herding to pasture, guarding against wolves, illness, or theft. The entire rural economy depended on their health. Taxes and tithes were often paid in livestock, and marriage portions or debts could be settled with a well-fed cow. Their hides became leather, their bones tools, their fat candles, nothing wasted. In a world of narrow margins, these animals were not property so much as partners in endurance, keeping hunger and cold at bay one day at a time. Time in the medieval countryside was measured less by calendars than by the work of the land itself. The seasons dictated the rhythm of existence, each one carrying its own set of labours so predictable that people marked their progress by what their hands were doing. Ploughing began as soon as the frost eased, the heavy iron share cutting furrows into the damp soil while oxen strained against their yokes. Sowing followed, a slow and careful process of scattering seed by hand, often accompanied by whispered prayers for good weather and protection from pests. When summer arrived, fields turned golden and reaping began, the most demanding and celebrated labour of the year. Whole families, even children, joined the harvest, knowing that every sheaf mattered. Afterward came threshing, the beating of grain from stalk, and winnowing, the tossing of chaff into the wind to separate what could sustain from what could not. Finally, in late autumn and winter, came rest of a kind, repairs, weaving and waiting. The cycle repeated endlessly, predictable yet never easy. The idea of months held little meaning when the land itself was the clock. Life was organised around the unbroken dialogue between soil and season, labour and survival, work and faith. The steady rhythm of labour was softened by moments of celebration, for even the most exhausting year required pauses to remind people why they worked at all. Festivals punctuated the agricultural calendar, blending Christian observance with older seasonal customs that refused to disappear. The sowing feast in spring honoured both faith and hope, as villagers shared food, ale and song before the planting began. It was a time to bless the fields, the tools, and the hands that would use them. When the harvest came, gratitude took a louder form. Processions, dancing, and tables briefly heavy with bread and ale. The work of gathering was gruelling, but when it ended, joy returned like a long-delayed guest. Winter brought fewer resources, but no shortage of ceremony. Midwinter feasts, echoing pagan solstice traditions, became intertwined with Christmas and the turning of the year. Fires were lit, greenery hung indoors, and people gathered to eat, drink, and forget for a night the cold that waited outside. These festivals offered more than rest. They affirmed continuity. No matter how hard the season or poor the yield, the next feast always came. Through them, the medieval year gained shape. Labour balanced by renewal, scarcity tempered by shared warmth and song. After the festivals faded and work resumed, one day each week stood apart from the rest. Sunday was meant for God, though the line between sacred rest and earthly necessity was often thin. The church required attendance at Mass, and bells called even the most reluctant from their fields. For many villagers, the service was the week's only formal gathering, a moment to stand beside neighbours, listen to Latin words few could understand, and feel part of something larger than the narrow boundaries of home. Clean clothes were aired, boots wiped, and the best posture adopted, even if hands still smelled faintly of soil or livestock. Afterward, the day continued in quieter forms of rest. Markets and manual labour were technically forbidden, though some small chores still had to be done. Animals fed, bread prepared, fires tended. For most, Sunday was less about leisure than about reprieve, a pause in the endless cycle of work that gave meaning to the rest of the week. Priests reminded their flocks of duty, sin and salvation, but the day also brought gossip, trade, and human contact. Whether out of devotion or habit, nearly everyone observed it. Sunday, like the bell that marked it, ordered the rhythm of medieval life. The same bell that summoned people to Sunday Mass also shaped every other day of the week. In a world largely without clocks, the sound of the church bell provided the structure by which life was lived. Its tolling marked the hours of prayer, labour and rest, dividing time into something recognisable and shared. Morning bells called workers to the fields, midday bells reminded them to pause, and evening bells signalled that it was time to return home and tend to the hearth. The rhythm of these sounds carried through every village, monastery and town, uniting scattered lives through a single pulse of metal and air. In monasteries, the bell held even deeper authority, dictating every hour of the monastic schedule, from matins before dawn to compline before sleep. But even outside the cloister, its presence was unavoidable. Bells rang for births, deaths, storms and fires. They announced feasts, warnings, and gatherings. They could sound joyous or mournful, sacred or practical, but they were never ignored. To live in the Middle Ages was to live by the bell's command. It ordered the days long before mechanical clocks took over, reminding everyone, peasant and noble alike, that time ultimately belonged not to them, but to God. The reach of the church extended into every corner of medieval life, from the grandest cathedral to the smallest rural parish. Even the most remote village had its own priest, a font for baptisms, and a graveyard where generations of the same families were laid to rest. These three elements, the priest, the font, and the grave, defined the spiritual geography of daily existence. Life began at the font, was guided by the priest, and ended at the grave, all within the same few yards of earth. The church was not simply a place of worship, it was a constant presence that marked the milestones of birth, marriage, confession, and death. For many villagers, the parish priest was the only educated person they knew, serving as mediator, teacher, and moral authority. He recorded tithes and marriages, offered blessings, and sometimes settled disputes when secular justice was distant. The churchyard was both sacred and social space, where people gathered for feasts, markets, and gossip as much as for prayer. In this way, the boundaries between the spiritual and the everyday blurred completely. Faith was not confined to ceremony, it surrounded people, like the air they breathed. The church stood at the literal and emotional centre of medieval community life. Though the parish church anchored village life, the words spoken within its walls often felt distant from those who listened. Latin, the language of the liturgy, was regarded as the language of heaven, sacred, ancient, and unchanging. It connected the smallest rural chapel to the vast machinery of the church in Rome, giving every mass the same solemn rhythm no matter where it was heard. Yet for most worshippers, its meaning was largely mysterious. Few peasants could read or write, and even fewer could follow the Latin prayers recited by the priest. Faith was experienced through sound and symbol rather than understanding. The cadence of chant, the smell of incense, the glint of candlelight on stone. This distance between language and comprehension did not weaken devotion. If anything, it enhanced the sense of awe. The words themselves seemed to belong to another world, one too holy to be translated into common speech. For those gathered beneath the wooden beams or stone arches, the Latin Mass was less a lesson than a performance of the divine. Meaning lived in the gestures, the sign of the cross, the ringing of the bell, the moment of silence after the Amen. In that shared mystery, heaven felt close, even if its words remained unreachable. For those who could not read the scriptures or follow the Latin Mass, the walls of the church became their Bible. Medieval wall paintings served as sermons in colour, telling stories that words could not. Scenes of saints, sinners, angels and devils filled the plastered surfaces, their figures painted in bold, simple shapes that even a child could understand. Christ on the cross, St. George slaying the dragon, or souls weighed at judgment. These images taught faith through sight and memory. The colours were vivid when new, reds made from ochre, blues from crushed minerals, gold leaf glinting faintly in candlelight. Over time, smoke and age dimmed them, but their message remained. The paintings were more than decoration, they were instruction and warning combined. A glimpse of paradise beside a vision of hell made moral lessons unmistakable. In small parishes, local donors sometimes appeared in the artwork, kneeling humbly beneath the saints they had paid to restore. The walls thus reflected both devotion and community, turning faith into something visible and shared. Even centuries later, faint traces of those pigments linger on old stone, silent witnesses to an age when stories were painted, not printed, when the walls themselves spoke the language of belief. Beyond the parish walls, faith sometimes demanded motion rather than stillness. Pilgrimage was one of the few forms of travel available to ordinary people, a journey that joined spiritual duty with the deep human desire to see what lay beyond the horizon. Some pilgrims set out to fulfill vows of gratitude or repentance. Others hoped for healing, adventure, or simply a change of air. Whatever their reason, each departure began with a blessing and a pack filled with essentials, bread, water, and a small token from home. Roads leading to holy sites like Canterbury, Compostela, or Rome became arteries of movement, lined with shrines, hospices, and the company of fellow travellers. The church encouraged pilgrimage as both penance and instruction. Walking long miles under uncertain skies reminded believers of humility and the frailty of the body, but it also opened a door to the wider world. Pilgrims saw distant cities, foreign customs, and relics that carried the promise of divine favour. When they returned, they brought home not only badges and souvenirs, but stories that renewed the imagination of their villages. Pilgrimage was devotion made visible, a reminder that faith was not confined to one place, but could be carried on the soles of one's feet across all of Christendom. As pilgrims moved from shrine to shrine, the power of sacred objects shaped the routes they chose. Relics, the physical remains or belongings of saints, held extraordinary importance in medieval faith. A fragment of bone, a piece of cloth, or even dust from a tomb could transform an ordinary church into a site of wonder. These relics were believed to carry the saint's presence, a link between earth and heaven that offered comfort, protection, and the possibility of miracles. Towns fortunate enough to possess one often grew wealthy as pilgrims arrived seeking healing, forgiveness, or divine favour. The authenticity of relics varied, but their spiritual power depended less on proof than on belief. Churches displayed them in jewelled reliquaries or under glass, carried them in processions, and guarded them as fiercely as any treasure. Competition among towns for holy objects was fierce, sometimes giving rise to elaborate legends of discovery or divine intervention. For ordinary people, touching or even glimpsing a relic was an act of faith, a moment when the sacred seemed almost tangible. In a world where daily life was uncertain and harsh, relics offered reassurance, that holiness could dwell in material things, that grace might be found not in mystery alone, but in the smallest fragment of matter. For all the authority the Church held, faith alone did not explain every mystery or ease every fear. Beyond the reach of Scripture, superstition quietly flourished, woven into the fabric of daily life. Villagers carried charms against illness, buried protective herbs near doorways, and muttered blessings before beginning a difficult task. A sudden sickness might be blamed on elves or the evil eye, while good fortune could be credited to the favour of a saint. The Church officially condemned such practices, yet even many priests tolerated them, recognising that belief in unseen forces was as old as humanity itself. Superstition filled the wide space between faith and experience, where the divine and the earthly met. These customs offered comfort in a world ruled by uncertainty. Weather, harvests, and health could change without warning, and prayers alone did not always bring results. So people turned to symbols they could hold: a sprig of rowan for protection, a cross scratched above a doorway, a whispered spell to calm a frightened child. For most, these acts were not rebellion, but reinforcement, a way to make faith tangible. In the dim overlap between religion and folklore, medieval people found resilience, a quiet blend of prayer and practicality against the unknowable. In a world governed by both faith and fear, sickness carried moral as well as physical weight. Illness was often interpreted as punishment, a sign that sin, pride, or divine displeasure had taken hold of the body. Recovery, when it came, was considered proof of mercy rather than medicine. The Church taught that disease tested the soul, urging the sick to confess, repent, and accept their suffering as a path toward redemption. Even so, people sought every possible cure, blending prayer with practical remedies handed down through generations. Monks kept infirmaries, offering clean beds, herbal salves, and spiritual comfort, while lay healers worked from cottages using the same plants found in hedgerows and fields. The line between divine intervention and human effort was thin. Physicians consulted astrology as readily as Scripture, believing the stars could influence the humours of the body. Amulets, relics, and holy water were used alongside ointments and poultices, the sacred and the medical mingling without contradiction. Illness exposed both vulnerability and devotion, reminding people that the body belonged ultimately to God. When a fever broke or a wound closed, thanks were given, not to science, but to grace. Every recovery was a small miracle, every survival a reason to believe that heaven still watched over earth. Though physicians might study for years at universities in Bologna, Paris, or Oxford, their knowledge was rarely accessible to the people who most needed it. Medical theory was steeped in classical texts by Galen and Hippocrates, translated and recopied by monks, yet the language of humours and temperaments often felt distant from everyday life. For most, healing began much closer to home, in the garden. Nearly every household grew herbs not only for cooking but for medicine: sage for strength, rosemary for memory, and thyme to ward off infection. These plants were tended with the same care given to crops, for they were both food and pharmacy. Women in particular served as keepers of this knowledge, passing remedies from mother to daughter in quiet continuity. Monastic gardens also supplied cures, cultivated by brothers who saw medicine as a form of charity. Their physic gardens contained dozens of species catalogued for specific ailments, each plant a bridge between faith and empirical observation. Doctors might prescribe elaborate treatments, but it was often a poultice, a tea, or a simple tincture that brought comfort. In this way, the boundaries between science, superstition, and faith blurred once more. Healing was less about mastery than balance between earth, body, and belief. The knowledge of herbs was one of the most valuable forms of wisdom in the medieval world, passed quietly between generations in an age when few could read. Plants like sage, rosemary and yarrow carried reputations that reached far beyond the kitchen. They were used to ease pain, close wounds, calm fevers, and preserve food. Their effects learned through centuries of careful observation. To those who understood their properties, herbs were wealth, not measured in coin, but in the ability to comfort, to heal, and sometimes to save a life. The humblest garden could thus become a sanctuary, its leaves and roots holding secrets that scholars in distant universities might never fully grasp. This herbal knowledge bridged the divide between practical skill and spiritual faith. Many believed that each plant held divine purpose, created by God to balance human frailty. Monks wrote herbal compendiums that combined scripture with medicine, while lay healers worked by instinct, guided by scent, texture, and memory. Some remedies genuinely worked, others soothed more through ritual and hope than chemistry. But whether grown beside monasteries or peasant cottages, herbs represented the medieval world's deepest understanding of health, that life depended on the earth's generosity, and healing came from what grew beneath one's feet. Among the many gifts drawn from nature, none was held in higher regard than honey. Long before sugar became common in Europe, honey was the universal sweetener, a rare source of both flavour and healing. Beekeeping was a respected skill, often practiced near monasteries or manor estates, where hives could be safely tended. Honey served as more than food. It was medicine, applied to wounds to prevent infection, and used in tonics to soothe sore throats or calm fevers. Its natural antiseptic properties were well known, even if not scientifically understood, and its golden colour carried a quiet symbolism of purity and divine favour. To sweeten a remedy with honey was to make the bitter bearable, both for body and spirit. Bees themselves were seen as sacred creatures, their industry mirroring human devotion and order. Monks read their behaviour as moral allegory, praising their diligence and harmony. The wax they produced became candles for altars, spreading the same light that honey had stored from summer's sun. In a world often defined by hardship, honey offered a rare taste of comfort, proof that something gentle and good could still be found in the wild. Its sweetness lingered long after it was gone, a small reminder of life's enduring warmth. Not every medieval remedy was pleasant, and few inspired more unease than the use of leeches. Where honey soothed, leeches drained. Bloodletting was one of the most enduring medical practices of the era, based on the ancient belief that health depended on the balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, it was thought, arose when one humour overwhelmed the rest, and removing blood was seen as a way to restore equilibrium. Physicians and barber surgeons alike used leeches for this purpose, attaching them to the skin to draw out the supposed excess. The procedure was neither rare nor scandalous. It was simply part of accepted medicine, practiced with confidence if not always with result. Leeches were kept in jars and sold by weight, transported across Europe in damp bundles. They were applied to treat everything from fevers to headaches, their slow, methodical feeding believed to cleanse the body of corruption. For all their unpleasantness, leeches did occasionally succeed, not through theory, but through the accidental relief of pressure or infection. Yet for most patients, the treatment left only dizziness and the faint sense of having survived something vaguely medieval. In the balance between faith and science, leeches occupied the murky middle, trusted, repulsive, and enduringly human. No lesson in mortality struck the medieval world more deeply than the plague. When it arrived in the mid-14th century, it reshaped every assumption about health, faith, and safety. Death moved with terrifying speed, sparing neither rich nor poor, and ignoring the boundaries of cities, parishes, and kingdoms. Physicians could offer little explanation, and treatments, from bloodletting to prayer, failed with grim consistency. The disease did not respect cleanliness or virtue. Even those who lived carefully and devoutly found it waiting at their door. The sheer scale of loss forced people to confront death, not as a distant event, but as a daily companion. Entire families vanished, and graveyards overflowed until the living could no longer keep up with the dead. The church struggled to offer comfort, as priests and monks died alongside their congregations. Faith itself wavered, yet superstition and hope persisted. Some saw the plague as divine punishment, others viewed it as proof of the world's frailty. Art and literature grew darker, haunted by images of skulls, hourglasses, and dancing skeletons, reminders that life was a temporary gift. When the worst had passed, survivors rebuilt what they could, carrying forward a collective understanding that death was never far away, even on the cleanest doorstep. In the wake of the plague, the landscape itself began to change. Burial grounds expanded beyond their boundaries, consuming meadows and gardens as graves multiplied faster than they could be tended. The speed of death left little time for ceremony. Bodies were laid in shallow pits, often without coffins, and covered hurriedly before the next cart arrived. In larger towns, entire fields were consecrated, simply to keep pace with the losses. Churchyards that had once been quiet places of reflection became crowded with unmarked mounds, where grass and time quickly erased the memory of those buried beneath. Stone markers, when they existed, sank slowly into the soil, their inscriptions fading until even names were forgotten. Yet life, as it always does, continued beside the dead. Children played along the edges of the graves, and families planted flowers among the markers, folding beauty into grief. The living and the departed shared the same ground, bound by necessity rather than fear. Over the years, the earth settled, and the scars of the plague softened into ordinary landscape, but beneath every churchyard and field lay silent evidence of how fragile survival had been. The soil itself remembered what people tried to forget, that death had once come faster than prayer. When death became too familiar to name, the living learned to adapt in quiet, complicated ways. Some turned to prayer, filling the air with chants and litanies that offered rhythm, if not relief. Religious processions wound through towns, incense trailing behind, as voices rose in unison, a plea for mercy, or perhaps for understanding. Others coped through song, finding in music a fragile sense of endurance. Simple melodies passed through villages, blending sorrow with a kind of stubborn hope. Singing did not undo loss, but it gave grief a shape that words alone could not carry. And then there were those who simply refused to look too closely. Markets reopened, weddings resumed, and laughter returned hesitantly, as though daring fate to listen. Pretending not to notice became its own form of survival, a way to keep despair at bay by restoring the habits of the ordinary. People rebuilt the rhythms of daily life, not because they had forgotten the plague, but because remembering it too vividly was unbearable. Between faith, art, and denial, the medieval world found its uneasy balance. Prayer soothed the soul, song steadied the heart, and silence kept both from breaking. In the end, endurance itself became the most common form of devotion. As grief settled into routine, the sound of church bells became the most familiar expression of loss. They tolled endlessly during the years of plague and long after, each slow note echoing across the fields to mark another soul's departure. Yet despite the sorrow they carried, the bells offered comfort as well as warning. Their sound reminded the living that death, though constant, was witnessed, that no one vanished entirely into silence. In towns where neighbours were buried within sight of their homes, the bell's voice served as both farewell and reassurance, proof that remembrance still existed even when the mourners were few. The ritual of ringing was deeply ingrained in medieval life. Bells announced births, called people to worship, warned of storms and fires, and in the end, guided the dead toward eternity. Each tone carried meaning, distinct in rhythm and duration, so that even from a distance, one could tell whether the bell marked joy, danger, or mourning. During times of widespread death, the sound never seemed to cease, blending into the background of daily existence. Still, it connected the living to one another, turning private grief into something shared. In a world accustomed to loss, memory was preserved not in stone, but in sound. When the tolling finally faded and the graves grew over, life began again with the same stubborn rhythm that had always guided it. Villages that had lost half their people found new hands to till the soil and mend the roofs. Fields left fallow were ploughed once more, and children played in the lanes where funeral carts had passed. It was not resilience born of optimism, but of necessity. The land demanded labour, and the living had no choice but to answer. Rebuilding was as natural as mourning, an act less of hope than of habit. The soil itself seemed to resist emptiness, pulling life back to the surface no matter how many times it was buried beneath death. Stone by stone, walls were raised again. Timber replaced what rot and fire had claimed. The same rivers that had carried away disease now turned the wheels of mills. Some villages vanished altogether, swallowed by time, but others rose where they had stood before, rebuilt from memory and need. The scars of the past remained, visible in uneven streets and churchyards too large for their congregations, yet the sound of work returned. In every hammer blow and plough line, the medieval world quietly declared its refusal to disappear. Though the church was a house of worship, the ground surrounding it belonged as much to the living as to the dead. The churchyard served as the social heart of many medieval villages, a meeting place where daily life unfolded alongside memory and faith. On Sundays and feast days, the space filled with voices and movement, people trading news, arranging marriages, settling debts, and greeting neighbours they might not see again until the next holy day. Market stalls lined the perimeter, selling bread, cloth, or candles, their presence tolerated by the clergy as long as business paused for mass. The boundary between sacred and ordinary life was porous. Devotion and commerce existed comfortably side by side. Children played among the gravestones, while elders exchanged stories near the gate. The same ground that held generations of the dead also carried the rhythms of laughter, bargaining, and debate. Announcements were made there, disputes settled, and processions began or ended beneath the shadow of the tower. The churchyard's constant use reflected the medieval understanding that life and death were not opposites, but neighbours. To live fully meant to exist within that shared space, between prayer and conversation, between the solemn toll of the bell and the hum of the marketplace. From the chatter of the churchyard, it was only a short walk to the bustle of the marketplace, where the true pulse of medieval life could be felt. Markets were held weekly in most towns and larger villages, transforming quiet streets into crowded lanes of noise and colour. Merchants shouted prices over the din, hawking baskets of eggs, sides of salted fish, wheels of cheese, and loaves of newly baked bread. The air was thick with smells, smoke, spice, livestock, and sweat, all mingling into a fragrance that was at once foul and familiar. Fabric sellers displayed bolts of wool dyed in deep reds and greens, while butchers worked with speed that left little room for refinement. But the market offered more than goods. It was a network of information. Travellers carried news from distant towns, and gossip moved faster than any messenger. Deals were struck, promises made, and reputations built or ruined in a single afternoon. For many, the market was their only glimpse of the wider world, a place where peasants and merchants, clergy and beggars briefly shared the same ground. Amid the chaos, the marketplace held its own kind of order, a communal rhythm as dependable as the church bell, sustaining both body and conversation alike. Despite the noise and colour of the market, few coins actually changed hands. In much of medieval Europe, money was scarce, especially in rural communities where small-scale trade dominated. Most transactions relied on barter, a practical system that valued goods and labour more than currency. A farmer might exchange a measure of grain for a pot mended by the village smith, or offer wool in payment for a neighbour's help during harvest. Bread, eggs and ale all served as informal currency, their worth fluctuating with the season. People kept accounts in memory rather than ink, trusting reputation more than written record. When money did change hands, it carried the weight of more than its metal. Medieval coins were valuable, but inconsistent, their worth determined as much by reputation as by royal decree. They were struck by hand, often from silver, and no two pieces were exactly alike. Over time, circulation wore them thin and smooth, erasing faces and inscriptions until they were recognised more by feel than by sight. Some were clipped, trimmed at the edges to shave away tiny amounts of precious metal, a quiet theft so common that it became part of daily trade. Each coin told a history of movement, passing from manor to market, from soldier to smith, linking countless lives through a chain of small exchanges. Because currency was scarce and uneven, its presence carried a certain reverence. People hoarded coins in clay jars or stitched them into clothing for safety. A handful could represent months of labour or the cost of a family's survival through winter. Debts were measured carefully, and payments made in person, often before witnesses. To hold a coin was to hold trust, in the crown that minted it, in the person who accepted it, and in the fragile idea that value could be captured in something so small, so easily lost, and yet so enduring. As coins and goods changed hands, so too did stories, carried not by messengers, but by merchants. These traders connected the isolated worlds of towns and villages, moving along the dusty, uneven roads that tied the countryside together. Their wagons creaked under the weight of cloth salt, iron tools, and spices, but they also carried something less tangible: information. Long before newspapers or regular post, merchants were the arteries of communication. They shared rumours of wars, new taxes, and royal decrees, as well as tales of distant markets and strange customs. In every town square, they became living chronicles, their words spreading faster than any letter sealed with wax. The life of a merchant was equal parts opportunity and risk. Successful merchants could rise above their birth, forming guilds that wielded real economic power. They built bridges, inns, and warehouses that slowly reshaped medieval towns into centres of commerce. For most, though, the road remained long and lonely, a path marked by the rhythm of wheels, the sound of hoofbeats, and the endless exchange of words and wares. In a world bound by silence, the merchant's voice was motion itself. For the weary merchant or traveller, the sight of an inn at dusk was a welcome one. Scattered along busy trade routes or clustered at the edges of market towns, inns served as temporary refuge for anyone with the coin, or charm, to earn a place by the fire. Their comfort was modest at best. Beds were crude wooden frames or pallets stuffed with straw, shared by strangers, and alive with the occasional flea. Food was simple but warm: bread, stew and ale, served in thick wooden bowls, by tired hosts accustomed to both gratitude and complaint. Yet what inns lacked in refinement, they made up for in conversation. These establishments were crossroads of rumour and invention. Travellers swapped tales of highwaymen, miracles or monsters said to haunt distant woods, Merchants exaggerated their profits, soldiers their battles, and pilgrims their piety. In a time when storytelling was both entertainment and currency, the inn was a marketplace of words. Many of these stories grew in the telling, drifting from inn to inn until they became part of the folklore that defined the age. Beneath the laughter and boasting, the inn offered something simpler and more enduring, a shared roof, a meal, and the comfort of human company on a long uncertain road. The warmth of the inn faded quickly once travellers returned to the road, where safety was never guaranteed. Medieval highways, such as they were, wound through forests and open moors that offered plenty of places to hide. Wolves still roamed the countryside, especially in the colder regions of Europe, and though their howls chilled the blood, they were not the greatest threat. It was bandits, desperate men, former soldiers, or peasants turned to crime, who made travel truly perilous. Roads connecting one market town to another were often narrow and poorly maintained, and a fallen tree or abandoned cart might conceal an ambush. Merchants learned to travel in groups, armed with staffs or short swords, and to wait for company before crossing dangerous stretches of land. Kings and lords tried to make the roads safe, issuing decrees and posting guards, but protection was inconsistent and often limited to routes near major cities. Beyond those boundaries, travellers relied on luck, prayer, and a sharp ear for approaching hoofbeats. Banditry was a symptom of poverty as much as wickedness, and its persistence reminded everyone how fragile order could be. On lonely paths between towns, the road itself became a test of courage, and sometimes of mercy. For those fortunate enough to live behind their walls rather than beneath their shadow, castles embodied both strength and discomforts. They were built to endure siege and display authority, not to provide warmth or ease. Their thick stone walls, while impervious to fire and arrows, trapped cold and moisture, turning grand halls into echoing caverns, where every step reverberated. Fires roared constantly in great hearths, yet their heat reached only those standing close. Tapestries hung on the walls were not merely decorative, but essential insulation, softening both the chill and the austerity of bare stone. Draughts slipped through arrow slits, and rain sometimes crept between the seams of roofs and parapets, reminding even nobles that comfort was a luxury the Middle Ages rarely afforded. Life inside a castle revolved around survival in a different sense, maintaining provisions, defending territory, and displaying status. Servants, guards, and craftsmen filled the courtyards with noise and labour, while lords and ladies presided over feasts or disputes in rooms that were beautiful only by comparison to the world outside. Despite their power, castles were never homes in the modern sense. They were fortresses first, symbols second, and living spaces last. Monuments to human ambition, built from endurance more than indulgence. Within those cold stone walls, life found its rhythm in the great hall, the heart of the castle, and the stage upon which both ceremony and chaos unfolded. It was here that lords held court, received guests, and displayed their wealth through long wooden tables heavy with roasted meat, fresh bread, and overflowing pitchers of wine or ale. Feasts served not only as celebrations, but as performances of authority. Musicians played, jesters entertained, and servants moved in careful choreography to maintain appearances of abundance and control. Yet beneath the laughter and music, politics simmered quietly. Alliances were forged and broken over shared meals, and a misplaced word could shift fortunes overnight. The same hall that hosted weddings and festivals could, on another day, witness betrayal or bloodshed. Rivalries among nobles were as volatile as the fires that flickered along the walls, and ambition often found its outlet in violence disguised as honour. Despite the danger, the Great Hall represented community and continuity. a place where stories were told, oaths sworn, and history itself recorded in memory rather than ink. When the feasts ended and the torches dimmed, the vast space fell silent again, holding within its walls both the echo of laughter and the shadow of intrigue. Despite the grandeur of castle feasts, much of what was eaten and drunk reflected practicality rather than indulgence. Preservation was essential in a world without refrigeration, and salt was the true foundation of medieval cuisine. Meat, when available, was heavily salted or smoked to keep it from spoiling, a process that lent it toughness and a sharp, briny flavour. Fresh cuts were rare outside of hunting season or major festivals. Even among the wealthy, the majority of meals relied on salted beef, pork or fish, often soaked and boiled to make it edible again. For common people, meat was scarce altogether, reserved for holy days or shared in small portions when the opportunity arose. Drink, too, was carefully managed. Wine, where available, was diluted with water to stretch supplies and reduce intoxication. In regions where vineyards were rare, ale or small beer remained the standard, brewed weak for daily use. Strong drink was associated with waste and vice, while moderation was both a virtue and a necessity. Spices and herbs were used liberally to mask the flavours of storage and preservation, creating dishes that were fragrant if not fresh. Feasting, then, was less about indulgence than about endurance, the art of turning what survived the year into a semblance of plenty. Dining in the Middle Ages was a tactile experience, far removed from the etiquette that later centuries would prize. Forks existed, but they were curiosities, used occasionally by the very wealthy or in parts of southern Europe, where table manners were more refined. For most people, fingers were the most practical utensils. Food was served in large communal dishes, and diners tore meat or bread with their hands, using small knives to cut what was too tough to pull apart. Spoons were common enough for soups and stews, but eating was as much a shared ritual as a personal act. One ate from the same trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that doubled as plates, and often drank from the same cup. Cleanliness was expected in theory, but flexible in practice, and hand-washing was usually reserved for guests of status or at the start of formal meals. Despite the lack of polish, there was a clear order to the table. Seating reflected rank, and conversation was governed by custom. Meals were noisy, generous, and often short, with entertainment following rather than accompanying the food. In castles and cottages alike, eating was less about refinement than sustenance and community, a momentary pause in the labour of living. When the trenches had been cleared and the last of the ale poured, medieval feasts often concluded with a mix of indulgence and intrigue. Sweetmeats, small confections made from honey, nuts, or preserved fruit, marked the end of the meal, signalling abundance in a world where sugar was still a luxury. Imported from distant lands and expensive enough to display wealth by their very presence, these treats were less about satisfaction than spectacle. Guests savoured them slowly, washing them down with spiced wine, as conversation shifted from polite formality to something looser, riskier, and more revealing. In the flickering light of torches, tongues loosened as well. Gossip circulated as freely as the drink, and every feast became a stage for ambition and rumour. Marriages were proposed or undone, alliances tested, and rivalries reignited over careless words. Musicians played softly to mask whispers, while servants pretended not to hear. For nobles, feasting was as much about politics as pleasure, and every smile might conceal calculation. When the candles burned low, the great hall emptied, some guests departing unsteady, others triumphant, a few already regretting what had been said. the sweetness of the night lingered briefly, followed by the familiar aftertaste of consequence that no dessert could disguise. When words began to falter and the last goblets were drained, music carried the evening forward. Every feast, fair and festival relied on it, weaving sound through the air like another kind of sustenance. In the great halls of nobles, minstrels performed with harps, lutes and rebecks, their melodies soft enough to flatter conversation, yet intricate enough to impress. The harp's bright, crystalline tones drifted through smoke and laughter, lending grace to rooms otherwise filled with the smell of meat and ale. But beyond the manor walls, music belonged to everyone. In village squares, it was the steady pulse of drums, pipes and voices that kept the rhythm of the crowd. Farmers danced, labourers stamped their feet, and the music turned hunger and fatigue into motion. The men and women who carried this music from place to place were more than entertainers. They were messengers in a world without mass communication. Minstrels wandered between towns, courts and taverns, their instruments slung across their backs and their memories stocked with stories. They were, in many ways, the living newspapers of the medieval world. Through song and verse, they spread news of battles won or lost, of kings crowned and nobles disgraced. Their tales mixed fact and embellishment freely, turning distant events into vivid performances. For many who heard them, a minstrel's song was the only glimpse of the wider world they would ever receive. Because they served both information and amusement, minstrels occupied an unusual place in society. They were welcomed for their talent, yet trusted only as far as their next verse. A clever performer could flatter a noble one night and mock him the next in another town. Some minstrels travelled under the patronage of wealthy households, while others survived entirely by the generosity of their audiences. In every case, their song stitched together a scattered continent, ensuring that no triumph or tragedy remained confined to one place. Long before printing presses or pamphlets, music carried the news, and the world listened. While minstrels carried stories through song, another quieter form of storytelling endured within monastery walls and scriptoria. Books were among the most precious objects of the medieval world, created slowly, page by page, by the hands of scribes who viewed their labour as a form of devotion. Each manuscript was a unique work of art, written on vellum or parchment, its letters shaped with deliberate precision, and its margins illuminated with delicate vines, saints or animals that seemed to move under the flicker of candlelight. Gold leaf was sometimes applied to the initials or borders, allowing the page itself to glow as if it contained its own light. To open such a book was to hold months, sometimes years, of patient labour. Because they were so costly to produce, books were rare and carefully guarded. Monasteries chained them to reading desks or stored them in locked armoires, and silence was enforced so that every word copied could be done without distraction. Few lay people ever touched one, and fewer still could read its contents. Yet even for the illiterate, the sight of a book carried weight, a symbol of wisdom, permanence, and divine truth. In a world where most knowledge was spoken or sung, the written word seemed almost miraculous. The creation of every book depended on the quiet persistence of monks, whose lives revolved around prayer, labour, and ink. In the stillness of the scriptorium, time was measured not by hours but by the slow consumption of candles and the steady scratching of quills against parchment. Each page demanded full concentration. A single slip of the hand could mar days of work. Monks sat hunched over wooden desks, the chill of stone walls settling into their joints as they copied not only religious texts, but also histories, treatises, and the remnants of classical learning that might otherwise have vanished. The rhythm of their labour mirrored their faith, repetitive, disciplined, and enduring, Illumination was a separate art, performed by those with the patience and skill to transform text into something sacred. Gold leaf, bright pigments, and careful line work turned ordinary words into acts of worship. Few outside the monastery ever witnessed this process, but the results spoke for themselves. To hold a finished manuscript was to touch devotion, made visible. In preserving the written word, the monks preserved civilization itself, ensuring that even in an age of war and plague, knowledge continued to glow faintly in the margins, kept alive by candlelight and prayer. The sheer effort behind each manuscript made the creation of a Bible an undertaking of almost unimaginable devotion. Unlike smaller books of prayer or psalms, a complete Bible required hundreds of pages, thousands of lines, and the unwavering attention of scribes who might spend their entire careers on a single copy. The process began with the preparation of vellum, the stretched and scraped skin of calves or sheep, followed by the careful ruling of lines, and the selection of inks made from soot, gall, or precious minerals. Every letter was shaped by hand, each word checked and rechecked against exemplars. The work could take decades, and for many, it was a life's calling rather than a project. Such Bibles were more than sacred texts. They were monuments to endurance and faith. Monasteries guarded them like relics, and cathedrals displayed them as proof of divine favour. The size and weight of these volumes reflected their significance, often so large they required 2 men to lift. When completed, they became communal treasures, meant to be read aloud rather than privately owned. In a world where few could write, and fewer still could read, a single Bible stood as the distilled effort of countless lives dedicated to preserving the word in ink, light, and patience. For those who spent their lives among books, the scent of vellum and ink became as familiar as incense in a chapel. Each manuscript carried its own fragrance, the faint sweetness of animal skin mixed with the sharp tang of iron gall ink and the smoky residue of candles that had burned beside it. To enter a scriptorium or a scholar's study was to step into that world of quiet concentration, where knowledge announced itself not with noise but with smell. The aroma clung to robes, fingertips, and quills, becoming an invisible reminder of the labour behind every written word. It was the perfume of learning, not polished or delicate, but dense and enduring, like the work it represented. For monks and scholars alike, that smell was inseparable from the act of thought itself. It marked the slow passage of hours spent reading, copying, or contemplating texts whose meaning often felt as heavy as the pages they filled. The materials of scholarship were living things, drawn from the bodies of animals and the minerals of the earth, transformed through patience into symbols of divine and human understanding. In a world still ruled by the senses, even knowledge had texture and scent, tangible proof that wisdom was something made by hand. Knowledge in the Middle Ages was both revered and restricted. Libraries were small, locked rooms rather than public halls, their shelves lined with handwritten manuscripts, chained to prevent removal. Access was granted only to those deemed worthy, monks, scholars, or clerics with permission from their superiors. To enter was to step into an atmosphere of sacred stillness, where every sound felt like an intrusion. The act of reading was treated as a privilege, not a pastime, and those allowed within often approached the books with the same reverence they might show a relic. The restrictions were practical as much as spiritual. Each manuscript represented years of labour and immense cost. To lose or damage one was to erase part of the community's intellectual inheritance. Catalogues were rare. An organisation followed memory rather than system, so only the initiated knew where to find specific works. Yet within those guarded walls, ideas travelled freely, from Aristotle to Augustine, from Latin to vernacular tongues. The locked door protected more than parchment. It preserved a fragile chain of knowledge that had survived war, fire, and ignorance, awaiting those patient and humble enough to ask properly for its wisdom. For all the reverence shown to books and learning, most people lived far from their influence. Knowledge in the Middle Ages was sacred, rare, costly, and guarded, but ignorance offered its own kind of peace. The vast majority of people were illiterate, their understanding of the world shaped by the rhythms of work, the teachings of the church, and the evidence of their own senses. What they knew was enough to survive. When to sow and reap, how to mend a roof, which herbs eased pain, and which faces to trust. The mysteries beyond that, of science, scripture, or politics, belonged to others. There was comfort in this limited horizon, a sense of order that made life comprehensible, even when it was hard. The learned, for their part, often saw ignorance as both a problem and a necessity. Too much questioning could be dangerous in a world held together by faith. The church itself walked a careful line, promoting moral instruction while discouraging inquiry that might challenge doctrine. To know too much was to risk doubt, and doubt was a peril to the soul, so ignorance endured not as failure, but as protection, a kind of humble wisdom that kept life simple and faith intact. The average person's universe extended no farther than a few miles in any direction, the distance their own feet could carry them. Villages were self-contained, surrounded by the same fields, rivers, and woodlands that had defined their ancestors' lives for centuries. A journey to the nearest market town might happen only a few times a year, and to travel beyond that was exceptional. Roads were poor, travel costly, and the unfamiliar often feared. The world beyond the horizon existed more in story than in memory. This limited geography shaped both imagination and identity. People defined themselves not by nations but by parishes, lordships, and family names. The boundaries of belonging were drawn close and everything outside them felt abstract. Foreign lands were places of rumour, described by returning pilgrims or merchants as if they lay halfway between heaven and myth. Yet within those narrow borders, life was rich in detail, every path, hedge, and neighbouring face known by heart. The medieval world may have been small, but it was complete in its own way, held together by routine, faith, and the certainty that home was the centre of everything. The forests that bordered every village were essential to survival, yet they were never approached lightly. To the medieval world, woodlands were both pantry and peril, sources of nourishment and danger in equal measure. From their trees came firewood, timber, and charcoal. From their undergrowth, berries, nuts, mushrooms, and wild herbs. Peasants gathered fallen branches and trapped small game, careful to take only what they could without drawing the wrath of the local lord or his foresters. Every twig and root had value, but so did caution. The woods were places of sudden silence and unseen eyes where a misstep could bring a broken limb, a wolf, or an accusation of poaching. Yet for all their hazards, the forests offered freedom that the open fields did not. Their density provided cover from both the weather and the watchful, becoming refuge for outlaws, hermits, and those seeking solitude or escape. Folklore described the forest as alive, a world that listened and judged, its spirits appeased with offerings or prayers. To enter was to barter with risk in exchange for sustenance. In every sense, the woodland sustained medieval life, shaping not only its economy, but its imagination, standing always at the border between safety and the unknown. For all its beauty and bounty, the forest was never truly free. It belonged in name and in law to the crown, or to local lords who claimed dominion over its game, its timber, and even its silence. Royal forest law was among the most resented systems of authority in medieval England and beyond, for it placed strict limits on what common people could take from the land that surrounded them. Hunting deer, cutting wood, or even gathering fallen branches without permission could be treated as theft. The forest's laws were as dense as its trees, and breaking them, whether by need or by defiance, could mean imprisonment, mutilation, or the hangman's noose. Foresters and gamekeepers patrolled these vast estates, watching for poachers and enforcing fines with unflinching severity. Yet for many peasants, survival required quiet disobedience, a snare set under moonlight, a bundle of firewood carried home at dawn. These were acts of both necessity and courage. The tension between authority and hunger played out daily beneath the green canopy. The forest that fed and sheltered also condemned, a place where law and life were perpetually at odds. In its shadows, the medieval idea of justice revealed its truest nature, uneven, unforgiving, and rooted in power. Hunting, like land ownership, was a privilege reserved for the few. The deer, boar, and pheasants that roamed the forests were legally the property of the lord, whose estate encompassed them, regardless of how near they came to a peasant's cottage or how empty the family's table might be. To kill a deer without permission was not simply theft, it was treason against hierarchy. The laws that guarded game were designed to protect status as much as sustenance, turning nature itself into a symbol of power. Hunts were grand affairs for the nobility, complete with horns, hounds, and pageantry, while the poor who trapped rabbits or birds for survival risked fines, mutilation, or hanging. This divide between privilege and need made the forest a landscape of quiet rebellion. Poachers became both criminals and folk heroes, figures who defied injustice under cover of trees. Ballads celebrated them as champions of the hungry, even as gallows reminded the living of the cost of disobedience. Hunger, after all, did not recognize ownership. The sight of a fat stag grazing near a starving village spoke volumes about the structure of medieval life, a world where the forest's abundance was not shared and where justice, like meat, was carved according to rank. The hierarchy of the forest mirrored that of the people who lived beyond its edges. Deer, graceful and untouchable, were the official property of kings, creatures so closely tied to royal privilege that killing one without permission was a crime nearly equal to regicide. Royal hunts were elaborate spectacles, choreographed displays of power where the taking of a single stag could involve dozens of mounted riders, trained hounds, and the blare of hunting horns. To bring down such a beast was to demonstrate control over nature and over the subjects who watched. In contrast, rabbits, smaller and far less noble, were considered common enough to catch. Yet in practice, both animals could lead a hungry peasant to the same fate if caught with a snare or bow in hand. The punishment for poaching was severe, not because of the loss of meat, but because it defied the order of things. The forest represented hierarchy, who ruled, who laboured, and who obeyed. Those who broke that line were made examples of, often publicly. The gallows that stood near the forest edge reminded every passer-by that even in the wilderness, authority reached as far as the sound of the hunting horn. In the medieval world, law and mercy rarely shared the same ground. Just as the forest's bounty was carefully rationed, so too were the materials that clothed the body. Clothing in the Middle Ages was a long-term commitment rather than a passing fashion. Wool formed the foundation of nearly every wardrobe, spun and woven locally from the same sheep that sustained the household with milk and meat. It was durable, insulating, and abundant, though rarely comfortable. The fibres itched, especially when worn close to the skin, but warmth mattered more than comfort. Garments were patched, mended, and handed down until they became more seam than cloth, each repair marking the quiet persistence of daily life. The process of making clothes consumed entire seasons. Women carded wool, spun yarn, and wove fabric on looms that filled their cottages with the clatter of wooden beams. Dyes came from plants or minerals, their colours muted but enduring, browns, greys, and faded greens that blended easily with the land. For the poor, new clothing was a rarity. For the rich, it was a language of display. Yet across all ranks, clothing carried the memory of labour from the shepherd's flock to the weaver's loom. Every thread told a story of survival, each stitch a small triumph against the cold that never truly left. The colour of one's clothing spoke almost as clearly as the cut of it. In a world where garments were handmade and materials precious, colour became a visual marker of status and wealth. The rich displayed their privilege through brightness. Dyes like scarlet, violet, and deep blue were costly to produce, requiring imported ingredients such as cochineal insects or indigo plants, as well as the labour of skilled dyers who understood how to set the colour so it would not fade. These vibrant hues were reserved for nobles, clergy, and prosperous merchants who could afford both the expense and the statement. A flash of crimson or a band of gold thread was enough to distinguish one person's rank from another's at a glance. For the majority, colour was dictated by practicality. Most peasants wore clothing in the natural tones of undyed wool, soft greys, browns, and greens that hid dirt and wear. The laws themselves reinforced these divisions. Sumptuary regulations restricted the use of certain fabrics and colours to specific classes. Yet within these limits, people still sought beauty, adding simple embroidery or bright patches where they could. Even the humblest tunic might hold a scrap of colour saved from another life, a small defiance against the monotony imposed by poverty and rule. Beneath all those layers of wool and patched cloth, the most fragile protection of all lay at the feet. Shoes in the Middle Ages were handmade from leather, stitched by cobblers who balanced craft with necessity. For the wealthy, they could be supple and ornate, dyed in colour, and cut to shape the foot with surprising elegance. For everyone else, they were crude and short-lived, plain pieces of hide bound with thongs or nailed soles, little more than a buffer against mud and frost. They wore through quickly, and many went barefoot in summer to save what little footwear they had for winter. In cold months, rags or straw were stuffed inside to provide a trace of warmth. Shoemaking was slow work, and each pair represented precious material that could not be wasted. When shoes split, they were mended. When beyond repair, the leather was cut into straps or reused for harnesses. Despite their simplicity, shoes carried social meaning too. A noble's pointed slipper and a peasant's heavy boot spoke different languages, yet both bore the same evidence of travel and toil. Every scuff and tear was a record of movement, across frozen fields, cobbled towns, and the endless distance between comfort and necessity. Children filled their days with play drawn from whatever the world placed in reach. Toys were rarely bought or made for amusement alone. Instead, children found joy in the ordinary. Sticks became swords, stones turned into livestock or soldiers, and a patch of dirt could serve as both battlefield and marketplace. The games they played reflected the lives they watched. Mock harvests, tiny weddings, pretend courts of justice, and rough contests of strength that echoed adult work and rivalry. Through play, children rehearsed the skills and hierarchies they would soon inherit. Some toys did exist, though simply made. Wooden dolls carved by parents, clay animals baked in the hearth, or hoops and balls fashioned from scraps of leather. Wealthier families might afford miniature knights or hobby horses, but imagination remained the most accessible form of play for all. Seasonal festivals offered moments of shared delight. when even adults joined in songs or games that blurred the line between work and celebration. Childhood was brief, yet its laughter was woven into the rhythm of daily life. Amid the toil and strictness of the age, play was a rare expression of freedom, a reminder that even the poorest could still invent joy. As children grew into the roles expected of them, play gave way to duty, and few duties were more defining than marriage. In the Middle Ages, weddings were practical arrangements first and emotional unions second. Love was a luxury, not a foundation. Families viewed marriage as an alliance of resources, land, labour and lineage, joined together to secure survival in an uncertain world. Among peasants, it meant combining hands to manage the fields and livestock. Among merchants and nobles, it was a contract designed to preserve wealth and power. The Church blessed these unions, sanctifying what was often an economic necessity, but affection was something hoped for rather than guaranteed. Yet despite the pragmatism behind them, weddings were still occasions for music, dancing, and celebration. Songs romanticized what life rarely allowed, turning obligation into something that sounded almost beautiful. Guests feasted, drank, and sang long into the night, as if joy itself could be conjured through effort. Gifts were modest, the food familiar, but for one day, the community shared in the illusion of abundance. Beneath the laughter and ceremony, everyone understood the truth. Marriage was less about finding happiness than about ensuring continuity. The next harvest, the next child, the next link in an unbroken chain of endurance. If marriage marked the union of households, birth was its most perilous reward. In a world without reliable medicine or sanitation, childbirth was both miracle and trial, a moment when the line between life and death narrowed to a thread. It was a community event, attended almost entirely by women, midwives, neighbours and relatives who gathered in cramped rooms, thick with the smell of sweat, candle smoke and fear. Their knowledge was practical, built from experience rather than study, and their tools were simple: linen cloths, herbal poultices, and prayer. Men waited outside, powerless and anxious, listening for the first cry that would tell them whether the night had brought joy or mourning. Every birth carried risk. Infection, blood loss, or prolonged labour could claim mother, child, or both. Survival was celebrated, but never assumed. The Church blessed new infants quickly, aware of how fragile life remained in its earliest hours. Yet despite the danger, there was comfort in the collective effort. The hands that steadied, the voices that soothed, the whispered words meant to keep fear at bay. Birth was a reminder that endurance depended not only on strength, but on community. In those brief tense hours, faith and skill were indistinguishable, and both were needed. Life in the Middle Ages unfolded within narrow boundaries, hemmed in by mortality, but animated by resilience. Infant deaths were common, and few families escaped grief, yet people continued to marry, conceive, and hope. The cradle and coffin often shared the same household, reminders that joy and sorrow were never far apart. Wooden cradles, roughly carved and passed from one child to the next, stood beside hearths for warmth. Coffins, when they could be afforded, were made from the same timber used for barns or doors. Death was not an interruption, but an ever-present companion, acknowledged openly rather than hidden away. Still, between these two constants, the beginning and the end, life found room to grow. Children who survived their fragile first years became the heart of the household, contributing to labour almost as soon as they could walk. The rhythm of birth and death shaped the community's understanding of endurance. Every baptism was a victory, every long life a quiet blessing. Laughter, work and prayer filled the days between cradle and grave, giving meaning to survival itself. For all its hardship, medieval life was defined less by despair than by persistence. A collective insistence that existence, however brief, was still worth continuing. Those who managed to outlast the cradle's fragility and the hazards of adulthood carried with them a kind of quiet reverence. Old age was rare enough to be respected, even feared a little, for it signified both endurance and divine favour. To live into one's 60s or 70s was uncommon, and those who did were treated as living records of memory. Their faces, lined by weather and labour, were as familiar as the landscape itself, creased with stories softened by time. Age was not associated with leisure or rest, but with usefulness of another kind. The elderly watched children, passed on trades, and preserved family lore that would otherwise vanish. Their knowledge of planting, curing, and prayer was trusted more than any book. Communities cared for their elders in simple ways. Grown children provided food and shelter when they could. Neighbours shared warmth and labour, and monasteries sometimes offered refuge to those without kin. In return, the aged offered counsel, tempering youthful impulse with memory. To grow old was to survive long enough to see patterns repeat, to understand that every famine, harvest, birth and burial had happened before. In a world obsessed with endurance, longevity was its own quiet form of holiness, proof that persistence itself could outlast everything else. From those few who reached old age came the village's collective memory, preserved not on parchment but in conversation. The elder was a walking archive of everything that had happened. The bad harvests and good summers, the names of families long gone, the location of forgotten wells, and the stories of saints or spirits said to guard the land. In a time when few could read or write, this living record was invaluable. Knowledge passed through speech, gesture, and shared habit, woven into the fabric of community life. The elders' recollections held authority, but they also carried warmth. Their stories gave shape to a past that might otherwise have dissolved into rumour. Children listened at their knees, learning lessons wrapped in anecdotes, while adults sought their advice on weather, crops, or disputes. What they remembered guided the present. When to sow, where to build, how to endure. Each death of such a person was a small extinction, an unwritten book lost to time. Yet the tradition endured, each generation raising new keepers of memory. In this way, history remained alive and intimate, preserved not by scholars in distant monasteries, but by those who had lived it, spoken in the plain, steady voices of experience. For all the wisdom carried by the old, death remained the one constant teacher, its lessons familiar to everyone. It came softly for some, slipping in with age or illness, and swiftly for others through accident, childbirth, or plague. Whatever its form, it was never unexpected. Medieval people lived in such close company with mortality that fear was tempered by familiarity. The church bells, the graveyard beside the chapel, the constant prayers for souls departed, all served as reminders that life and death existed on the same breath. People did not speak of death as interruption, but as completion, a passage both ordinary and inevitable. The rituals surrounding it reflected that acceptance. Neighbours gathered to wash the body, candles were lit to guide the soul, and the priest performed the final rites with words so often repeated they became almost soothing. Funerals were communal affairs, solemn but not hopeless. Grief was expressed openly, yet faith softened its edge with the promise of reunion beyond the grave. In the quiet that followed, daily life resumed without fanfare, because it had to. Death's presence gave the living a strange kind of steadiness, an understanding that time was borrowed, and that endurance, even in sorrow, was its own form of grace. And that brings us to the end of tonight's walk through medieval life. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.